So in this video today, I want to explain to you the basic foundation of what individuation actually is. A lot of people talk about this idea and it becomes very theoretical, it becomes very abstract, very dreamlike, people going on about, reading your dreams, and that is a kind of an answer to what individuation is, but it's not really. The fundamental foundation to individuation is that the opposite of individuation is procrastination. So if you're procrastinating, you're doing the opposite of what individuation is. So what I have developed is a framework of looking at this in a practical, understandable way that is actually based in more of a reality of logic rather than that of dream and fantasy and idealism, which so often is these ideas are based in. The basic idea is that we need to see that, of course, if you're procrastinating, you're not individuating. So what you need to do is figure out how to break the procrastination trap. And procrastination is basically, the way I frame it, is a blanket statement for every mental block that you could have possibly. So it's like, if you have OCD, if you have intrusive thoughts, if you have fear, if you have social anxiety, different forms of fear, it all comes under procrastination. Because it's something that's holding you back from individuation itself. It's not too complicated, that's basically how I see it. So when we're looking at this framework or this model, we need to look at the three forms of self that we have in our lifetime to understand what individuation is. Individuation is getting your present self going towards your future self, and there being a repetitive cycle towards that destination. Procrastination is the opposite, so your present self is stuck with your past self, and it's a constant repetitive cycle, and it's a trap and you can't get out of it. The reason why you're not individuating is because you cannot get out of the procrastination cycle, break it, so that you get onto the individuation cycle instead. And what you need to get onto that is self-awareness as a fundamental principle. But the thing that's keeping you inside the procrastination cycle, the trap, is unconscious fears. So usually there is some sort of unconscious element of fear associated to why we always keep doing the same thing over and over again, and why we don't break out of that. The basics of the unconscious fears, to understand what they are, usually comes down to fear of rejection, fear of criticism, and fear of failure, and fear of commitment. They're like the fundamentals, the fundamental fears that obviously branch off into other intricacies of different fears. It could be like the symptoms, so like OCD, intrusive thoughts, social anxiety. They're the reasons, the broad understanding of fears is what creates the symptoms of what the fundamental procrastination is, and why we're procrastinating to not doing certain goals, is to then understand those symptoms, and then we work through those symptoms through coaching. And then we apply the first principle of achieving individuation to those problems, which is self-awareness. Now, it's very difficult to be self-aware. This is why you do coaching, and why coaching is usually mostly successful with most people, because in the world we live in now, it's like, well, okay, people's values are not aligned as much as they used to be. There's the culture war, there is political disintegration, political ideologies that are getting more separated, and there's this constant alienation between people's values in different cultures, between different people with different personalities and all of this. And because of that, there's less of an ability for, like, let's say young guys, for example, to find a kind of like brotherhood or a network where your values align really well with each other. So for example, when I get people coming in through my service, people calling me and stuff, so often the case that it's like, oh, I cannot find someone or a group of people that have the same values as me, or it's like I have friends but they're not really very good friends because we don't align on our values and we're not all motivated to work towards something. And it's like, okay, the reason why coaching comes into that whole process is because it's simply a shared value facilitation system. You're facilitating a communication, and this is facilitation coaching is basically what Carl Rogers developed. You're facilitating a space between the coach and the client, the individual, where you basically have the same desires of what you want to achieve, and the facilitated or the coach that offers facilitation is to best, and this is how I try to do it as much as possible, is to offer a mirror to the individual who you're working with. So the person just constantly sees themselves through you. And this is done best through things like the Socratic method, Socratic thinking, and Socratic questioning. Because this goes against, this fundamentally allows the individual to become over time more self-aware of themselves, their thoughts, their feelings, their actions, their emotions, so that the client can become more self-aware, can become more aware of the cognitive distortions that they're using, so that they can then break the procrastination cycle, so that they can enter into a path of individuation, which is upwards towards their future self. So what happens is you look at the symptoms, what the obvious symptoms are, and then you apply a conscious lens to that of self-awareness through the methods and the techniques that I use, which are fundamentally built around Socratic thinking, because you need to think of it like this. Philosophy is the foundation to most psychotherapy even. It's the foundation to most ways of thinking, how to deduct, how to decipher things properly with good logic and rationale. But Socratic thinking is very much cognitive behavioral therapy. It's basically based around that. You're working with logical fallacies, you're trying to understand an effective way of approaching things which may or may not be true, so that you can observe yourself in a third perspective, so that you can learn and become more self-aware of yourself and the experiences that you've had in the past, so that you don't allow them to keep you down and keep you in a specific place through procrastination that you don't want to be in. And the reason why this is so difficult, and self-awareness or even situation awareness, the reason why this is so difficult is because in a world, especially the Western world, where our values are so detached between different people with ideological opinions, that in itself inflates an ego bias, it inflates a cognitive bias, it inflates a lot of these things which keep us very defensive, but at the same time not being very aware. So we're more defensive than aware of ourselves or the other person's opinion, or how there might be a misunderstanding of this and that, because we so easily fall into these biases that we have, because our culture, in a sense, kind of promotes it. Now, of course, Carl Jung didn't offer any solutions to how to actually individuate. It was very much an abstract idea. It was very more, the way he saw it was kind of like, okay, this is a way of life. This is a life philosophy, how you should orientate yourself, that you should always be trying to discover who you are. But the fundamentals of that is understanding the dynamic of individuation and procrastination. This is why I always go on about procrastination, and why I've built a coaching system to go around this idea, because, and I don't see, this is the thing as well, I don't see any fundamental Jungian psychologists going into anything like this. I don't see them framing it in this way. I don't see anyone frame it in this way. That the opposite of doing what one needs to do, following that will in that way in which makes it to be your own. The opposite of that is procrastination. The opposite of that is putting things off, is putting off the things that you know you need to do. That's fundamentally the descriptor and the definition of procrastination, because it's like, I know I need to do this, I know it's holding me back, but I'm scared of doing it, I haven't done it, I'm in fear of doing it, and then understanding what those fears are. And I think understanding the broad range of kind of maybe like the 4 main forms of fear on a very broad level that relate to most people is the best way of trying to decipher then understanding the symptoms in which you may be having. And this really is a lot of things, because I've worked with many people who have had intrusive thoughts, social anxiety, anxiety towards certain objects, anxiety towards doing certain things particularly that are maybe a bit more obscure, and it comes down to a fear that relates to their past self, and they are stuck in a cycle of that entire system. and understanding that is the best way to break out of it. And using, like I said, the principles of self-awareness and the methods in which have been developed through philosophy that improve your accountability, that improve your productivity, that improve your self-understanding using those principles within philosophy, the pillars of philosophy, because philosophy is the groundwork to every subject in everything. If you go to university, philosophy is the foundation to it all, because philosophy is the question itself. The question itself is philosophical. Why are there molecules? Why is this the case? Why does this happen? Why is this? Everything in university is on a question of why, but in a specific domain, the first question of why was within philosophy. Then everything developed out from philosophy is the foundation. And of course we see now today that in universities, philosophy, well, especially in American universities or Canadian universities or kind of North American universities, all this type of stuff, not only is it so expensive, inflated beyond any degree of understanding, but that philosophy is not the bedrock of most universities, and most of them don't identify that philosophy is the bedrock of all subjects and all questions. And it is the bedrock of self-development and self-improvement. That's why being perspicacious, having perspective is so important. A very simple analogy is, if you don't have perspective, you could see one thing in one certain frame of positioning that looks like a certain act is being done or a certain thing is happening, but from a different perspective, it could be a completely different situation. And this is what I think Nietzsche was getting at when he was coming down to the question of truth, is that the truth is that things are in perspective, that perspective exists. That is the truth. Is the earth flat or round? It's both. It's like my empirical experience, I don't know if it's flat, but it's probably both, because I experience both forms, right? People go up in space supposedly and see that it's round, but I experience it as flat. Maybe it's both. Why can't we just accept it as both? This is the thing, it's like ideology claims the grand narrative of truth from a certain subjective position, but of course it creates divide and it causes an issue because the specific position is not the full truth. It is just a perspective or a certain opinion or a certain angle of looking at something that is far more complex than just a simple answer to anything. And this is why, people ask me like, are you into politics? What do you believe about this? Do you believe in God? I get asked these questions all the time, and like it's a little bit people always seeking out one answer. And this is understanding, because it's like the human condition. It's like, I want one answer to everything. I want there to be an answer to happiness, an answer to meaning, an answer to all this. And even like when you talk about purpose is like, even with this video, is like individuation. That's your purpose. To overcome all hurdles. So therefore the purpose of life must be to just experience life and experience it from all the angles we can. And it's that's the answer. I mean, you have all of these different isms, and you have these different philosophers who would commit to different isms like existentialism, nihilism, what's it called? Epicurean? I can't remember how it's about, like the ism for pleasure and stuff like this. But it's like they're all relevant. And this is why so many, people go back to like the best philosophers weren't the ones from the 19th, 18th century. They're more from the Greek period, or the pre-Socratic period. We have like Heraclitus talking about very similar things to that, and which could be understood through the Tao in Eastern spiritual circles. Whereas like you don't step into the same river twice. Like things like this, change, flux, things in constant opposition and that change is a fundamental part of nature. And that is very well understood in the spiritual world through the Tao, but it's less understood and maybe even less desired through Western philosophy, because through Western philosophy it's not as... It seems to be there's more of an idealistic Renaissance kind of approach to, you know, you had the Enlightenment period where it's like, we need answers, we want a specific reality. But the Eastern tradition kind of more accepted that change is inevitable and it's something that always happens. And of course, they're the more wiser for it. So if you enjoyed this video and you relate to this big problem of individuation and procrastination, and that you're in a procrastination cycle, book in a free call with me, free discovery call on procrastination, on individuation, where we can apply this model to you specifically to see what we together can do through coaching sessions and all of this, if you are down for it. So if you definitely think that is an issue for you, make sure to book a free call in with me in the link in the description that you will find just underneath this video. And with that said, thanks for watching guys, and I'll speak to you in the next one.